Okay, this is a response to Paul Vanderklay's video, The Rise and Fall of Jordan Peterson and the IDW, David Fuller, Andrea, and Ellul. I, a bit embarrassingly, I haven't watched this whole recording. I'm basically halfway through, 50 minutes through 1 hour and 40 minutes, so I'm sure I'll continue to watch the whole video. I have enough comments to make that I don't want to. Uh, I would rather make a recording before making further comments. Just to make sure that sort of these comments that I'm going to make aren't too compressed. Anyway, yeah. So I'm going to attempt to answer some of the questions which Paul Vanderklay seems to be sort of meditating on. Which I feel like I get annoyed sometimes listening to Paul Vanderklay because he seems to be meditating on these questions, which I think he knows the answers to them. They're not complicated questions, but he continues to meditate on them, which is slightly confusing to me. But and he has I think correct perceptions and observations in terms of how he is framing a lot of this stuff, but I find some of it imprecise and some of it a bit sloppy. So I think this is cured by having just a much more precise and incisive critique of of the things that he underlines as being confusing or problematic or whatever that he's pondering over. So what is the IDW, or like what was it meant to? Yeah, I'll this is a nebulous subject. I'm going to have to start somewhere, so let me just start by pontificating about let's say the true value, or the goodness in the concept of the IDW, and where it got off track and how it derailed itself to some degree, blah blah blah. So what the IDW effectively should be is that it should be a discussion, or a debate, or a forum for cashing out and discovering and putting together what the meta modern uh, uh, solution is to the zeitgeist, to the general predicament, so and the intellectual matters and issues that are involved in that. And so the point of the IDW is that you get Jordan Peterson debating Sam Harris about, sort of ideas, so that we don't have some idea, because essentially one of the huge problems is because we do need a return to modernity, but a more fortified and tempered, sort of structure to solve a lot of these problems, which I also think that is the actual solution to a lot of these things. Paul Vanderklay talks about, sort of how secularism was like the second project, or the sister church, in some sense, that it was a Christian project to a large extent. And, we're not, I don't think that even civilization is going to be capable of surviving its passing. I don't think in a world with thermonuclear weapons and things like that, I don't think you can have the dissolution of secularism. I do think we need a revision of it, and a lot of that comes. I've in particular, I've come up with my diagnosis with what these problems are, which I call the Napoleonic corruption, which is something that I link to, kind of some links to Nietzschean philosophy about morality and things like that, but also sort of that we need a sophisticated kind of secularism that is philosophically entrenched with epistemic responsibilism, as opposed to epistemic reliabilism. But anyway, I'm not going to talk too much about the Napoleonic corruption, but that the Napoleonic corruption exists in certain governmental legal frameworks, and we are invalidating the fundamental dignity of the individual, even though sort of, I think America is somewhat a good example of this, is that you are beholden to the Democratic majority. So if 51% of people vote for something, the judges in your courts are going to bend over backwards to facilitate whatever your legislature is trying to do, whatever their intention is, and they're going to interpret it as uh, uh, as liberally as they can to be within the boundary of the constitutional framework. The Constitution is a very feeble form of protection. It does not really protect the citizen. Every card is played in order to facilitate the legislature's uh, uh, plenary power, and your rights, your fundamental rights, keep on getting redrawn, and you don't have proper remedies, and essentially, in my view, it's all pretty much void for vagueness, because you can't have absolute rights. You have to have a limitations clause. Then at least then you can always argue about it with in terms of the criteria within that limitations clause. Anyway, that's I think the only way that you can actually entrench the dignity of the individual. And so I do believe in a kind of robust secularism, and I do think that that's generally the solution to all these things. That we have to have it, a level playing field in which the government and the individual is kind of on an even plane. Anyway, that's. And I do think that the lack of this, that the Napoleonic corruption as it manifests within the legal domain, means that the identitarians, the identity politics people, are correct to exploit the system, because in some sense that it is true that if you have influence over legislatures, if you have a majority within the people that create regulation and the law of a society, because essentially in America, the law itself is the law of man. It's not. Uh, um, it's the rule of man. It's not the rule of law. Because the law in America is not substantively principled and coherent. It's invented. And everyone in America is like a lab rat, because the substantive law in America is trial and error. They make it, then they remake it, and then they repromulgate it, and then they amend it as they so wish. There is no comprehensive, substantive jurisprudence that is actually making sure that these values and these principles, are sort of that there's a fabric that undergirds and that makes the moral, ethical virtue of the system. That's all just experimental. That's experimentation for your legislature to treat you like a lab rat. That is a manifestation or a permutation of the Napoleonic corruption, perhaps in one of its meekest forms, but it's certainly probably better than Napoleon himself or than sort of the Nazi state. But what it does force you to do, it forces you to, in some sense, unless you're willing to promulgate a culture war constantly over the state of the law. And then it also puts a lot of pressure that you have to ventilate these issues within the culture, and everyone has to be sort of so politically engaged, because you can't just go to a judge and have a court case as an individual against what the state is doing. You don't have proper tools, you don't have proper implements, because quite frankly the American rights are void for vagueness. They are vague, and they don't have. If you don't have a right, if there is no remedy, if there is no remedy for you available, I mean, your only remedy really is at the ballot box, and to be involved in politics. That's not dignified, because 51% of the population can essentially outvote you. This is a version of the Napoleonic corruption. Anyway, sorry, let me just put that aside. So. I think it's slightly unfair to say that Jordan Peterson is a mourner of the Blue Church. I mean, I can kind of get what I think that that criticism or that observation is more pertinent to Brett Weinstein. I think that's certainly true in Brett Weinstein's case, and it is in a more subtle way. It's slightly true about Jordan Peterson and I mean these are the lines that I draw. Is that the IDW lost its cohesiveness, or it lost let's say the sort of the teleological coherence that it might have had, or cogency, when I mean, like, what is really to stop Russell Brand from being considered part of the intellectual dark web, or what is to stop? I mean, well, Joe Rogan is considered part of the intellectual dark web. I mean, obviously, then it's worthless. I mean, like, what the hell is it for? If it's just for people that supposedly are in this special club and they talk to one another. I mean, if you're not willing to have this debate about promulgating or framing the debate around what the meta-modern consensus should be, then I don't see, what the point of view is. And I mean, Joe Rogan is useful because he's got such a huge audience, and he has allowed his platform to facilitate and to ventilate, these very important cultural issues, and he has shed some light onto that. But I don't think, I mean, Joe Rogan, I think at some point could have even been considered completely on the fence. I mean, Joe Rogan, I still think he can go anyway. He doesn't. I don't think he follows any kind of precise ethical consistency, which is quite frankly why I'm very hard against Brett Weinstein, because Brett Weinstein, I think, on these he talks out against, sort of identitarian ideology, but he has a lot of intellectual sympathy with all of their sociological reductionism and all their, and they're talking about statistics, and, I mean, he's basically a kind of unconscious racialist himself in some sense. When I've seen him weigh in on, some of these questions of race in American politics, I think that, he has dropped the ethical ball, and he is anyway. So I find him not to be that much of a convincing proponent. Although obviously personally his story, he has taken a large hit. So his whole genesis to the spotlight is, sort of being persecuted by identitarian ideology. But I find it ironic that he essentially does not take a stringent enough ethical stand against the intellectual how could I describe it? The intellectual pretense that launches, the kind of the racialist identitarian narrative that, that I find that then he only confronts and contests superficially, where he's fudging these ethical lines. So I find it very unhelpful. Which is, I mean, the reason why I brought up Russell Brand is because I think Russell Brand is a tremendous bullshit artist in the same way. I made a whole recording just about that. But, and I think that Jordan Peterson willing to entertain Russell Brand, I mean, to me, maybe is trying to sort of build his credentials as someone who is, sort of mending fences and willing to reach out and has a kind of secular tolerance of heterodoxy and things like that. But I don't know, as soon as you accept people who are so sort of lackadaisical or dishonest, intellectually incoherent, but also, sort of, I don't know, the kind of bullshit that Russell Brand is peddling, I think is one of the most dangerous variants, because it's it's designed to boil the frog in the pot of sort of CRT. I mean, he pretends to to believe in some kind of coexistent tolerance between sort of liberal values and identitarian narrative sort of epistemologies. It's just nonsense. It's I would even call it proto-fascist nonsense. So that's the kind of compromised, sort of loose bullshit thinking that gets you, sort of a half-baked Napoleonic, never-ending, sort of cycle of unaccountable politics and, you know, some kind of feudalistic, perpetual, sort of. You're always solving the last problem by spawning a new revolution. And it's always the same. It's just got different labels and different categories attached to them. If you allow that kind of narrative, sort of slave morality, and you grow tolerance for it, and especially if you try to develop a state that can contain both of those things. I mean, uh, it's not going to be an open liberal state. Um, there's also another point about this which is quite important. Slipped my mind. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, I think that there hasn't been enough. I mean, on the level of ethics, there's just been so much nebulousness, and that has, let's say, caused the IDW to fall. Is that it's sort of, and I like to think that, I mean, the things that I'm talking about probably sound incredibly political, um, and in a lot of ways that they are. Um, and I think Jordan Peterson has been more correct in his focus on the culture war, and perhaps been only remiss in not linking that up with a more broader intellectual, ethical translation of the culture war that he could knock on the door of these other people, and so I mean I do see that there is that kind of schism, but perhaps between John Vervaeke uh, and Jordan Peterson, because John Vervaeke has sort of kept it in a very purely intellectual, sort of thing. I think in some sense, um, yeah, this is a broad kind of topic, but I mean John Vervaeke brushes shoulders with a lot of people that are, um, let's say, very, very tolerant of people who have a lot of woke ideology in them, and sort of that have these heterodox communities that avoid the culture war by sort of leaning into, um, you know, pure cerebration and just very abstract intellectualism. Um, and I think that I'm not I'm not I don't think that this is a fair criticism against John, but I think that this is a theme that I even see in Paul van der Klay's uh, analysis of these sorts of issues, is that um, it's really creating a blind spot around a, a coherent ethical, um, the subject of ethics is just sort of it goes amiss, and I think you can do that when you can say, oh, these people are mourning modernism, or they're and uh, or they're mourning the blue church. I think that the idea of progress, or at least ethical progress, in the framework of some kind of modernism, and requires there to be some I some ideas that you can actually have progress around. So you would have to actually have some awareness of what the psychology is, or what the spirit is, or what a human being is, in terms of its fundamental characterological constitution. What are its component constituent parts of its mental faculties and intellectual uh, um, domain. And I think that, there is a lot of skepticism around those issues in the postmodern toxic world, or whatever. And, sort of leaning too hard into that kind of skepticism, um, obviously, is what makes it toxic and parasitic. Um, but I see reflections of that in what I would call Paul van der Klay's dancing around this topic, and I think that, there's not much to meditate on. Um, so I mean, my criticism is on all these things, is I feel is just much more pointed, um, and I think that what would bring the project much more to a head, and what would make these things start to converge more, is a focus on how these intellectual topics are translated into ethical, sort of ethical, political frameworks and structures, and you know, it, there to talk about principles, is that it can be very hard to talk about principles, because you can't talk about them in a purely sort of rational kind of way, because so many principles that are sophisticated are not like rationally necessary to be imposed or to be impelled, because many principles only come into effect after you already have some kind of value or preference as to as is that you would prefer that they would get involved. So they kind of are quite squishy on that sense, that you can't sort of rely on them as the kind of as the obvious default, because they're not the kind of obvious default. And then sort of, if you use the the skeptical lens, then uh, there are almost no principles that are um, deployable, except in some incredibly abstract uh, form, in which most principles can't don't operate in that way, because sort of the only thing that is left behind in the kind of lens of skepticism is something like generalizations and abstractions, and a kind of a god's eye view of the individual, of the subjective perspective, but from a third person. Whereas um, obviously, so skepticism forces us into that kind of vantage point, which is unnatural, which is not the level at which real principles are actually ever, you know, uh, utilized and proposed and negotiated, or at least refined within one's, because there are at least sort of two sets of principles, and principles are very sort of complicated sort of things, because you have to have principles which basically have the reflections of your chosen axiomatic values implanted within those principles, and then you have other principles of sort of just of how those principles get affected within their sort of or how you can put them into practice. And so, yeah, I mean, so much about principles are sort of organic and uh, essentially contended from quite a humble sort of position of, sort of that you have to almost technocratically um, refine them as well. Which is why I think that institutions, sort of their Aristotelian, sort of there's a good 5 minute video on the good life by Wireless Philosophy about the Aristotelian view of the good life, and that you need society to sort of have certain institutions, which, I mean, in some sense, I do think that there's almost a version of this where individual people have to develop the kind of intellectual capacity of something like the categorical imperative. And without certain institutions like the judiciary, I think as soon as you know that your society has a courthouse in its midst, and that is where new law is discovered and where controversies are solved based on the individual's capacity to reason, you have a reification of the dignity of the individual, and in some sense, you have a manifestation of the categorical imperative in practice. And ironically, what things like identity politics try to do, which is part of what I describe as sort of the Napoleonic corruption, is they think that instead of empowering individuals to live in such a society, instead we're just going to create a different kind of institution, a different kind of sort of executive function, which will mediate for you and which will institute the effects of every individual pursuing and their use of the categorical imperative, and their negotiation and persuasion and communications that are framed within that sort of that framework of dignity of the individual. Um, Now, obviously, what I'm describing is not sort of the zest of life, but it is, in some sense, I think, the actual framework within which you actually have a decent secular system that's capable of reproducing itself culturally. That sort of ameliorates the sort of the contradictions of what I describe as the Napoleonic corruption, which I think we inherit from our substandard, suboptimal legal systems, etc., and frames of government, framework of government, and that it ends up as a residue in the zeitgeist. It ends up as dirtying our culture, and eventually then, yeah. So I mean, I want a sort of a more stringent kind of secularism, because I do think that, to follow Paul's point about secularism being a sort of a sister of the church, I think that what has happened is that this version of secularism is not a good sister for the what I would consider to be a more accurate rendition of the doctrine. And because the fundamental contradictions of this secular system have sort of are flailing about and conspicuously revealing themselves, that the problem is to sort of to upgrade the whole framework is, I think, might be beyond the kind of the limits at which pedagogy, in terms of the great mass of, you need a sort of an intellectual elite that develops and bears out, at least the thesis that I'm or I'm what I'm saying is that sort of this is my thesis. I think that it is basically true, but without a whole lot of elites trying this thesis, as in putting it through its paces, like debating it and debating, and it surviving, sort of the criticism of it, but also checking out, the different potential permutations of how this general thesis gets realized in updating our framework so that we actually have a proper scaffolding for a revitalized culture, which has, in some sense, I was going to make a separate recording that is interesting that, you can't almost, I think you can't have a movie about contemporary reality. You couldn't produce a movie that was set in reality anymore because it would be surreal. It would be like, sort of, they would have to mention the lockdown. They would have to mention the aftermath of something, because it's sort of, there's a loss of some sort of core stability. And um, there was another point to this, but sort of the credibility of the status quo is so fragile, and it's so sort of conspicuously being supplemented by sort of the over reactive pageantry of sort of the pseudo sense making apparatus of the mainstream media that it's, I imagine that this is what it was like to live in Soviet Russia with sort of propaganda agencies and such. Um, but in some sense, this is good because I mean, sort of I see everything as an opportunity, but the world is coming to an end in this way. It's coming to a halt. It's when I say coming to an end, what I mean is that it's stopping. Sort of it's slowing down into complete immobility. Um, and I think that there's a reflective surface in that lack of external commotion that is a way to sort of reckon with the actual uh, spiritual contents, or I was going to say psychological contents. Um, and I think that what we are lacking is that we are lacking specifically a kind of a confidence in. I mean, I guess this is, I think, the height of why we value secularism is that there must be a form of justice which is acceptable. Uh, there must be a conception of justice which is palpable, uh, and that is robust in some ethical dimensions, and is capable of being substantiated and is capable of reflecting the dignity and the capacity of the individual. And I think that as things slow down more and more, the inhumane elements of the system that we are conjoined with and that we are a part of um, I mean, in some sense, it doesn't have to be a reflection of your own internal dignity if you can just sever the link yourself conceptually and say, well, you know, I'm within it, but I'm not a part of it. But sort of the slower it moves and the more it becomes a mirror of the self, and in some sense the external environment, I think, should not be a mirror of the self, but uh, I think that there has to be recourse within the subject of justice in which it's possible to extract an accurate depiction and some kind of respect for the dignity of the individual. So that there should be institutional capacity within the secular framework of society, um, where you can discover justice, where you can be part of promulgating it, that it isn't just part of voting for the right for the winning team, but as an individual. Yeah, I mean, that might seem pie in the sky to some people, but I do think it is the only way that you stably ever uh, cleanse the state of its, you know, sort of nature of bending to entrenched sort of vested interests, etc., etc. But and I have lots of other I have other sort of arguments around this, but I mean, I do think that it's worth pointing out that the so-called secular framework uh, I think can be saddled with the blame for the kind of corruption or the kind of cultural uh, toxicity that we are suffering from. I think that there's a clear structural link between these things. Although that might be quite an esoteric uh, tangent to draw, I do think it's the proximate source of it's interesting because America, I think, almost had this built into the destiny of its fabric. You know that it needs an update of its legal system. But anyway, what else? I guess I made the point. yes, that's my general thesis. It's not even that. It's not that complicated. It's not that much I can talk about. Uh, yeah, this feels like it's going to be something of an addendum to the comment that I made about Paul van der Klay's video, although it's not going to be germane to that exactly. I'm just going to take that as sort of the starting mass of subject matter and go off in different directions. So, I've, because of Paul van der Klay repeating John Vervaeke's 4 Ps of truth, or 4 Ps of knowledge, or something like that. There's propositional truth or knowledge, there's perspectival. Oh, let me do them in order that I've. So I actually think that the first one, yes, I don't know if I should give it ontologically or epistemologically, because anyway, I've mapped this over onto my 4 sides of the mind. And then obviously my 4 sides of the mind is a particular epistemological way of looking at it, and an ontological framework of how it actually develops in the individual psyche. So the superego is the procedural, the ego is the perspectival, and ontologically that is what happens first, and that I think is described by the relationship between the false prophet, or sort of the representative of the god of the world, having to in some sense initiate an initial perspectival framework, and from that perspectival framework you have a really what's the word, okay, I can't think of the nice word, but you have a very young ego that is in some sense just almost like a metaphysical entourage of a burgeoning prepositional structure. The subconscious is the prepositional, and that is going to, and this is why sort of the children are so fundamentally sort of juvenile, but also rigid in a kind of in a dreamlike way, is because their ego doesn't have an anchor. And I think that in some sense, what eventually anchors the ego properly in maturity is that obviously you have to have enough complexity and, let's say, boundaries and layers within the prepositional, that certain sets comport into a stable perspective of the role that you're playing in a particular participatory context, which is the unconscious. So the participatory, so eventually you need an anchor in the unconscious, but that's only in some sense you will only have stable sets of prepositional pools of spheres of operation when you've got the unconscious and the subconscious somewhat experienced in tandem, correlating with one another and anchoring a solid ego framework that is being channeled in that participatory context, and you have a stable perspective. So yeah, I think Vervaeke's 4 Ps are very complementary. So just to add some more description to this, is that the subconscious, my definition of it, I've always said that it is your sense of be, how you be. And so that's made up of literally sets of prepositional structure. And obviously when you're young, there's just one set, which is why you need, in some sense, your parents' ego grooming the boundaries of the perspective so that you can experiment and develop subconscious prepositional structures within that kind of safe cocoon. And there's a lot of internal development that has to happen before you can start to have a stable ego, or an ego that has a kind of stamina. There's another word that starts with a D that I can't remember, but that means sort of what's the word that means sort of that you can sustain sort of that it's capable of maintaining itself in sort of wear and tear, that it doesn't deteriorate. But there's another word that starts with a D that just means sort of like stamina. But anyway, So that quality of the ego, sort of needs, I think, I think that quality of the ego only takes on that mature sort of more adult-like um, idea when you have a kind of mastery over the ego, to some degree, some kind of which, I mean, there are different levels of mastery, I guess, because there's a kind of Keegan stage 5, sort of meta integration of a lot of these sides of the mind together. But I think that you can kind of have a pseudo stability of this, at least when you start having compartmentalization within the subconscious, within the prepositional sets, because then you can kind of be in one role, and then that one role can consider another prepositional set. So you can kind of have an internal dialogue, as it were, um, in some sense through the lens of the unconscious side of the mind, where you can imagine, okay, well, maybe I should blend these two prepositional sets to make a new amalgamate of what would be operative in this participatory context, giving rise to a different perspectival framework. Anyway, so I mean, the other interesting components of this is how these things are almost different in the context of time. Like, in some sense, the prepositional is always the prepositional and the ego have somewhat of a similar kind of time frame to them, because the preposition is always, you're always viewing it from the present as if it's already complete, as if it's sort of, it's a reference, as if it's a record of something, so you're kind of looking at it from a timeless perspective, whereas that's perhaps more like the subconscious, but the ego especially is sort of in present time. So you're sort of you are purveying the context of the perspective in present time. You're actually emulating it, as the lens of your mind in some sense. So it's almost like a filter. It's a salience filter, or something like that. Um, but the prepositional is in some sense the library bank that is creating the hologram of the present uh, uh, salience, and is filtering, according to that sort of subconscious code. Um, and it's interesting as well, because I think that once we get into the more developed or more mature individual or something like that, you often get dislocated from the art of the subconscious prepositional priming, as it were, because it's being subconsciously crafted from the perspective of the unconscious and the ego, from the participatory and the um, perspectival. And the reason why I call the participatory the unconscious is because it's what you are. First, participatory, you're doing it, but you don't know what it is that you're doing, but you are experiencing it, and it is in some sense the kind of the ever unfolding context, and it has generically, I mean, I call this also where principles need to be seen as the operating objective framework, because if you do something, it has to be, um, activity needs a I don't know how to put this. It needs a geography, it needs a terrain, it needs a reference point, um, it needs a frame, sort of that you can plot what's going on. But you know, the problem is that it's an ever malleable sort of interpretation, and so because it has to sort of, you have to know what it is that you do subjectively, but then you're also capable of revising that subjectively. So you have to have some kind of measure of backdrop or medium within which. So I mean, I call this the medium of mystery. So I think that's why it's called the unconscious, is because it's fundamentally mysterious. And I think that the most responsible way to eventually cash that out is there's sort of there are two ways of cashing that out. And I also link this with Keegan stage 3, which is why it's often so messed up to people and so toxic, is because you can either cash it out as a narrative, as a fatalism or a determinism, or a sort of that you are part of a system, you're part of the world, you're part of a dominion or a narrative of some external locus of control. Or in order to preserve an internal locus of control, you have to have a very sophisticated metaphysics to govern the unconscious. And I believe that that is basically principle, that you have to, that is the subjective reception of something like a concept like the natural law or something like that, that you can't, although you might be able to hypothetically posit something like the concept of the natural law, you can only imbibe that or internalize that through or replicating it into your principles. Um, and so it always has a humility attached to it that you can only ever be quickening, because in some sense, and this is almost the defect of humanity, is that we're not born with a perfect unconscious side of the mind. Um, we don't know what it is that we do in some sense. We can only hear the truth as a witness, and that witness is always in the present. And it's not the same as it's not the same as the identity of our own references to ourselves in the past. So it's always a living, eternal witness in some sense. And this gets you into the sort of the dualism of the spirit and the world, and sort of and all those sorts of things. So you need quite a sophisticated metaphysic, I think, to sort of to handle the participatory without relying on a kind of epistemic reliabilism and a narrative and a slave morality and some kind of sort of fudged metaphysic. And this is where I think people get into certain I mean I didn't watch Paul van der Klay's video on who's a better Christian, John Vervaeke or Jordan Peterson or something like that, but um, I this is always a definitional thing to me, because I'm in deep disagreement with many so-called Christians on doctrinal matters. And so I would be very happy to say that, yeah, I think John is essentially uh, is essentially he is exercising what I would consider to be a Christ consciousness, essentially. That he is pursuing that path and that journey, and it doesn't really matter what he calls it, or something like that. And he has enough sort of sensitivity, I think, that he is quickened when he is confronted with something that he doesn't have this uh, hubris to save the life that needs to sort of be sacrificed to some kind of internal process or rebirth, or something like that. And I think that is the quintessential sort of those who uh, oh man, I can't even remember the Jesus quote. Those who want to protect their lives will lose it, and those who will give up their lives will save it. That's the kind of uh, the parable on that, and that is really the meekness of the spirit. That is the discerning spirit and the spirit of truth. And I think that is the sort of the quintessential thing. It's got nothing to do with things that you believe that happened 2,000 years ago. God is not a lover of persons. There's no these are people that believe in the vicarious redemption, and they have a wicked false doctrine, and they can disguise it and propagate it in different forms, and they will have a hideous spiritual residue as a consequence of it. But in some sense, I think that those kinds of radical, or the radical revision or reframing that I'm proposing um, to those so-called Christian beliefs, they are enamored with their narrative. They belong to the God of the world, and they have given it a crucifix and sort of Christian window dressing and symbolism or whatever, but it's meaningless. Anyway, okay. was I going to say more things about the ethics or about the and I did have like two vague themes that I wanted to clean up some of the things that I said, because I just kind of I did sort of go in like a bull in a china shop and just kind of pontificate about some of the themes, but in a very sort of loose kind of way. I was trying to criticize, and I mean, I did even try to slightly criticize John Vervaeke in by keeping this in, let's say, unadulterated intellectual topics in which there. I mean, yeah. So I mean, it was interesting because I mean, the tension between Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke within that conversation um, is that John is talking about a lot of things, and Jordan Peterson is trying to root it into the culture war to some degree, or is trying to well, what relevance does this have on this kind of topic, on this kind of issue? And in some sense, I think that there is the slight schism that might be happening there on some level is that well, Jordan Peterson is first of all not in his best shape, um, but, uh, uh, but I think his inclination is that there is merit in that, which he's trying to ground it into something pragmatic, like, and in some sense it mirrors or reflects what Paul van der Klay has even said, like that we wanted there to be something productive coming from the IDW as the solution to sort of the quagmire that we're kind of in, and I mean, obviously, it's worthy to go into sort of deep intellectual things when you're diagnosing things that have to be carefully outlined so that But I do think that on John's side of dealing with these matters, I think he has been drawn into communities where they have pontificated in kind of intellectual minutiae, um, and even aided by Paul van der Klay himself, because in some sense there is this. I mean, there is. I think it's. And you see, maybe I can't be too harsh about this, but that there is a reticence within. I mean, you said Paul van der Klay is obviously sensitive to um, the toxicity of at least one of the sides in the culture wars, but yet he is reticent to develop that into a um, into a position, an awareness of that toxicity. He's reticent to develop that into a bastion that can be defended in some sense, or in at least in a general sense. He'll perhaps defend it on maybe some liberal secular sort of libertarian I mean I'm but he seems to have the kind of sentiment and attitude of maybe like, well, within some kind of paradigm of live and let live, we can see that this stuff is toxic and wrong. But I mean, obviously, Paul van der Klay is not a politician. But I mean, in some sense, I think that this is part of the general malaise of why we are sitting with this problem, is because um, there is a reticence to make a prescription. There is a reticence to say, well, this is the general solution, and this is the diagnosis of the fundamental problem, and this is how we ameliorate the structural deficiency. Which I mean, maybe I'm projecting because I have made these diagnoses, I have made these calculations, and I think I have a thesis that sort of deals with all these things. and then I'm also quite despondent myself, because I realize that almost the what I'm trying to publicize is so sophisticated that it has no hope of sort of being part of a grassroots groundswell. It has to be championed by intellectual elites. It has to be it has to fill the halls of the of sort of the people at the top debating it, for it to gain sort of traction, because it is not a simplistic sort of identitarian narrative that is, in some sense, I think, the only kind of thing that can be leveraged from the top down in some kind of which is, I find, problematic, because then you end up with a reactionary movement, which is in some sense just as um, problematic as the thing that it's the antidote to. Anyway, I've kind of lost my thread a bit on. I mean, it's but this is kind of my point of criticism against what even John Vervaeke and Paul van der Klay have been indulging in, is essentially this kind of very erudite intellectualism um, that is watered down to the point at which that you can try to make it a kind of lowest common denominator, that you can kind of reach across the aisle, or that you can sort of try to speak in a way, in a kind of in a language um, that is receivable by things that you should not be trying to gift, sort of access to, and this is my whole point. I mean, this is why I severely criticized Jordan Peterson for the kind of bread that he breaks with Russell Peterson, because I don't think that the bread is that this is a facade, that this is a mockery of breaking bread. That there's no ethical coherence here. It's just you're giving a platform to bullshit, which is in some sense that's also why I'm reticent about, or why I think that the IDW completely lost its cohesion when sort of people tried to say that Joe Rogan was in the IDW. It's sort of, it just, now you have enlarged it to a vacuous, hollow, sort of. I mean, I guess let me play devil's advocate with my own sort of polemic on this. Is that uh, I guess you could say that the biggest credential that Joe Rogan had to being in the IDW was that he was a friendly platform for heterodoxy, or something like that. Um, which is something that I don't actually even accept, that he is necessarily a friendly platform. I think that, in some sense, very, I think he almost could have gone, sort of, I mean, I think people don't I mean, I guess I take a very psychological, critical view of these things, because I'm taking it almost on the level of spirituality, and so I'm very critical of a lot of things, and I think that the fundamental problem with Joe Rogan is just that he doesn't he, quite frankly, he just doesn't care about the ethics of it. He does not care. Um, how he talks about it, he talks about it as if it's a sociological phenomena, and he does always reduce it down to sociological phenomena. And if, in some sense, he wouldn't notice the trampling on the principles, except that sort of, that he can see it in the um, because enough other people have made enough noise about it. Um, and he sort of denotes that kerfuffle, he notes that disquiet as as it being controversial, and that's how he talks about it. Anyway, I don't want to sort of pick on Joe Rogan. I mean, he's not, he doesn't try to be sort of an intellectual elite. So I mean, it's sort of uh, he doesn't brand himself like that. So I mean, I think it's not his fault that other people labeled him as the intellectual dark web, but I think that is what essentially I mean, I guess people could say to me, well, then you're saying that the intellectual dark web is, I mean, I think that, if the intellectual dark web, I mean, perhaps this was the fundamental problem with the whole practice of it, not with the concept, but with the practice, is that if the intellectual dark web was sort of not capable of disassociating with people that were no longer considered to be part of it, then it kind of lost all definitional integrity. And I mean, for example, Sam Harris. I mean, I think that, um, I mean, I even very starkly disagree with David Fuller, in terms of, I mean, it's half true what he says about Trump and what he says about the left. But if you notice just the lack of the ethical framing of that he denotes these as and they are correct sociological observations. Oh yes, well, because Trump was in politics, he was exciting the identitarians because he was a proof of their worldview and their thesis. Well, I mean, who cares? I consider that a positive, not a negative, because these people are insane. These people are toxic. And the idea that you're going to disprove them by trying to fit within the lines of their coloring book, like that is the path to educate them out of it. No, these people don't. It's not a lack of education. It's a lack of ethical coherence. They need to be rebuked. They need to be criticized. They need the temperature turned up on them. I mean, is the framing, saying. I mean, it's also a correct observation that this is. You could say that this is a, what did they call it? A civil war on the left. Well, who the fuck cares? I mean, like, as if this is only affecting people on the left. So it's everybody else's fault to get out of politics so that the left can try to clean up its own house, which it won't be able to do. You know, because of the toxicity of the thing that they're up against. Because in some sense, the kind of the ethical content of the identitarian ideology is what needs to be targeted, and it's not being targeted by Brett Weinstein. If Brett Weinstein does not, I mean, okay, you'll just have to. This is part of my thesis: is that Brett Weinstein has done a terribly shit job. That he does not intellectually debunk identity politics. In fact, he's very sympathetic with a lot of their intellectualism, with a lot of their sociological reductionism, and this kind of amoral or ethically agnostic way of framing political issues and framing these cultural issues and framing the intellectual aspect is part of the malaise that sits us in this quagmire. And so, yeah, so I'm somewhat refining what I was trying to get at in what I guess I'll tack this on. This will be just attached to the Van de Clay comment. I mean, I said all these nice things about John Vervaeke. It is perhaps it's unfair to try to leverage preemptively praise and then sort of say things that you would hope that he would absorb and adapt when it's going to have such a participatory um, if people would adopt what I'm proposing, they would find themselves much less popular, much more what's the word? Sort of the nail that sticks up, um, and perhaps much more isolated, perhaps as sort of alienated as I am. But And there is something to be said about diplomacy, but diplomacy without a clear vision, without let's say a properly grounded teleological impulse, drive, without, let's say, diplomacy without the right imperatives um, inculcated within it, is just I mean, I agree with Paul Vanderklay's observation, the fall of the IDW. I mean, I do. I mean, this is why I like Eric Weinstein in terms of uh, the parts of his character that are certainly admirable. Is that he has this edge to him. He has that darker edge to him, and he did name it the intellectual dark web. And I think that and when I say that dark edge, I mean uh, you, if you're not going to be aware of the darkness, if you're not going to be aware of the consequences of sort of not hating the right things and not taking a stand against the right, well, anyway, Eric is very capable of meting out that kind of grim, uh, that necessary sort of revulsion for things. Um, and I think that character, that is a basic component of healthy, honest intellectualism, which which needs to really, you have to have the patience of being able to lean into it, and so you can have, which is bringing your grievances to bear. Um, I do think that Sam Harris is um, is a deeply flawed intellectual in many ways. And I always thought that sort of I think that it was right that he was included in the intellectual dark web, but I think that his status of staying in it should have always been sort of or it organically would have, he would have found himself on the sort of on the periphery, and sort of eventually kind of excluded. And I think that his and this is really all to do with I mean, I see this Brett Weinstein doing this as well, and I think that it is somewhat conscious that these people are they are playing a game within left wing circles, within left wing politics, where they have to take a certain line so as not to be spat out by enough of their, or that they want to proselytize to people. So they're not willing to set up a fence. I mean, uh, and so the cognitive dissonance looks conspicuous to me. It's obvious around Sam Harris, that he looks like a bit of a lunatic, in terms of Trump derangement syndrome. But and I think he's somewhat been bitten by. I mean, I could make a nice sort of poetical metaphor. Um, but I think he has basically succumbed to the fundamental sort of dishonesty of the status quo, of this general crisis that we were in. That he has fallen into some level of supplication. That he has, sort of. So I see this in gradations. That sort of Sam Harris has bent the knee indirectly to the identitarian narrative by playing ball with it and being anti-Trump and imbibing its sort of and lending credence to sort of the echo chamber of the kind of the general of having to produce the general intellectual consensus needed in order to secure the the echo chamber of the sort of left wing narrative. And so all these people have been tripping over that cocoon that exists in order to insulate and promote the kind of the narrative ego, the collective ego, which this whole sort of toxic left wing insanity requires in order to sort of psychologically sustain itself. Um, and Brett Weinstein, I think, has more judiciously and diplomatically tried to play this game because he wants to be a kind of gateway drug to sanity, perhaps. Um, in terms of his treatment of Trump, I think that that's certainly true, but I do have greater things against Brett in terms of his ethical nebulousness, and where I consider him to be actually dangerous to actually dealing with identity politics properly. Um, because I do think that you know it's not enough merely to say, well, I don't like something. You have to actually make a coherent, substantive argument as to why identity politics is like, because you have to systematize its banning. You have to systematize. You have to describe it in some kind of philosophical way as to why it needs to be, something that looks like that needs to not be promoted through public funds, etc., etc. Like why this is a dangerous thing, and he can't do that. He can't do that because he buys into too much of the statistical reductions and generalizations, and the identitarian sociological framing of things. He doesn't take an ethical stand against these things. He effectively because statistics are empowering, I guess, to a science-minded person. It's the technical sweetness is too alluring. Never mind that these sociological models are fundamentally amoral. Are fundamentally toxic to liberal democracy. Are antithetical to non-racialism. He doesn't have the ethical sensitivity. Um, and in some sense, it is part of sort of the sort of the soft racism of the left, of saying, well, some people need their identitarian narrative because it's the only thing that makes them feel better about themselves, or something like that. Never mind that it disempowers them and robs them of their agency. Um, Let them have it. It's that kind of which is itself, sort of the whole, as a model. That is how this pollution, that is how this corruption replicates itself. It's sort of that's how it sort of becomes a never-ending cycle. Anyway, what's worse is how it sort of skews the whole sort of political. So I mean, it's not as if you can't have politics that seeks to help disadvantaged people or that seeks to promote their interests, but they need to actually have policy that targets them, in non-racial generic terms, means tested or something like that, or that is actually targeting a particular problem that they actually have, that actually fixes that problem or ameliorates it. That it's not just some sort of uh, blanket benefit that just gets designated to you based on some superficial characteristic that the program is not even fixing. That you just have this endless, which is you have the problems of sort of moral hazards and perverse incentives and um, anyway. Uh, and I think that is what happens when you proceed from morally corrupt um, viewpoints of things. I mean, also when you try to frame these things within history, which is utterly useless. I mean, why? Why does it matter how something happened? Just look at how it persists in the present. Look at what is recreating it in the present. You know, you have these horrible conflations between moral causation and historical causation, which are so ethically bankrupt. And anyway, I mean, perhaps these are sort of such sort of sophisticated things, but the lack of procedural meticulousness on these sorts of things. I mean, they are quite deep, and they are almost on the realm of religion to some degree, or some kind of spiritual philosophy. That I mean, it worries me because at some point, this has to. I mean, you can have a legal system and you can have a civics education that has this attitude and these sorts of spiritual frameworks, sort of suggested or sort of gestured at, sort of pointed at as the uh, as the dignity of the individual that the system is there to sort of propagate and collaborate with in promoting, sort of its internal agency and dynamism in its own private, pursuits and behavior and activities. And that's the thing, is you can never have a system that is actually purely, you know, you, you can't expect sort of perfection to some degree, but not having a consensus over, let's say, some kind of ethical framework, or having a kind of vacillation or nebulousness over, you know, what the state is there to, in some sense, spiritually respect about um, the fundamental constitution or integrity of its individual citizens. You kind of you let the devil in to sort of fiddle with interpreting. If you give it any kind of leeway, it's going to metastasize, which it has in this case. I do think that this is all a symptom of the problem of the American legal system, or and governmental framework in general. But yeah, I mean, I'm not going to repeat myself too much, but sort of, it's all really comes down to the rule of law, and that America does not have the rule of law, because the rule of law is not about peace on the streets. It's about not having the rule of man. And America certainly has the rule of man, because the law itself is invented, and the citizen is experimented on. The law itself has no, it's evenly applied, but it's not, it doesn't substantively persist in any substantively principled, coherent way. It is engineered and innovated and invented on the fly, experimentally. And I mean, I'm fine there being as many states as they want there to be, having their own experimental constitution, but those constitutions really need to be robust, and they need to offer judicially available remedies against the regulator itself. And then, I mean, I guess, the problem that I'm describing, or the technical problem is well, then you have a sort of a dictatorship of the judiciary, and that is exactly what I think is required. I think we do need to have I think the judiciary does need to be the strongest um, arm of government. Obviously not in terms of the judiciary inventing things. I mean, based on a constitution that actually has proper rights and a limitations clause, um, in which the citizenry can prompt the development of the law independently. Um, anyway, I mean, I guess that the problem always is this capture. That if the judges are ever captured by a cabal or something like that, that at least you can vote in new political leadership. It's somewhat harder to replace judges, although it is possible to. What is the word? Uh, oh, they tried to do it to Trump. What is it called? Oh my word! What is it called? Impeach. Impeachment. I mean, that would be a new kind of politics if essentially politics was not about. Politics was primarily not about voting in political parties. It was in sort of voting in political parties that could police judges and impeach them if their intellectual, the intellectual rigor of their judgments were not. I mean, that I guess is the check and balance on the judiciary. Is ultimately is that you can impeach judges. Anyway, uh, anyway, I'm babbling now.